I used to be an OTR truck driver that drove with another guy. This job only lasted a year in total, but within that year, I had some strange encounters on the road. Despite some of the weird people, there was one guy that creeped me out more than anyone else. He's one of the main reasons I stopped driving in the first place. The interaction happened at night. We were driving a load down to California, set to arrive the next day at night. I had arrived at a rest area in Arkansas at about 3:30 a.m., just having finished my drive time and getting set to take my 10-hour break. It was dark, with light rain, and the rest area in particular was down a bit from the highway and completely encircled by trees. Perfect spooky atmosphere for the interaction I was to have. I clocked out for the night, did a quick scan around, and I hopped out and locked the truck. The rest area was pretty quiet. There were a few sparse cars in the parking lot and a couple of semis that decided to sleep here for the night, an assortment of benches around with some canopies over them to shield them from the rain, and I was walking to the restroom to take a leak when I saw a man in the dark, smoking a cigarette and sitting on one of the benches. Walking past, my anxiety raised a bit, but not enough to set up alarm, and I decided to keep heading to the restroom. I handled my business and washed my hands, and then I headed back to the truck. The man was still seated in his original spot, but his body language told me he was now watching me. His face was shrouded in a shadow due to the overhead light, but his whole body turned as I walked past. Getting slightly paranoid now, I picked up my pace back to the truck, finally hopped inside and quickly locked the door. Figuring the worst of my anxiety was over, I decided to turn the radio back on to finish one of the comedy shows I was listening to, and finish the beef jerky I had bought from earlier. As I raised the jerky up to my mouth, my peripherals sensed some movement, and I looked up at the benches for that man. He was no longer sitting at the bench, but was now perched underneath the light post about 10 feet from my truck. My anxiety flooded back, and I sensed something was off. Something about his posture was bothering me, like I could sense this man didn't have good intentions. I shut the radio off at this moment and I stared back. This guy didn't move at all. The shadows covered most of his face, but I could tell he was staring in at me. This stare down felt like it lasted for 10 minutes straight. He didn't even lift his arm to take a drag from his cigarette that was still lit. Feeling like this situation was too strange, I called to my co-driver, who was sleeping in the cab. What, dude? He said, still waking up. Hey man, I finished my shift, but there's also this dude staring down at me in the truck outside. I hear him move about and peek through the cab curtain. What, dude? He said. I look back and the dude is gone. I freak out when I scan all over, and when I look in the driver's side mirror, the man is now walking slowly towards the back of the truck, with cigarette in mouth. Looks like he's walking around the truck, I say. WTF? Really? What side is he on? My co-driver says confused. At this point, the dude had circled the back of the truck and is now walking up the passenger side. He's on the passenger side now, I say. I slid over to the passenger side and I grabbed my knife off the dashboard just in case. My co-driver finally sees him walking up in the passenger side mirror. The guy stops right by the door and starts peering into the lower window of the passenger door. For those of you that don't know, semis tend to have a window on the lower part of the passenger door, so you can see if any cars are in your blind spot on that side. Considerably freaked out, I yelled out, "What do you want, asshole?" Which made the man leap back and step on his tiptoes to try and peer into the higher window. He could see me looking at him now. He had to be in his 50s at least, a very skinny man with bright blue bugged out eyes, but he had a deranged look on his face, like confusion mixed with malice. My co-driver says, "Can we help you?" Upon hearing that there's two of us in the truck, the man abruptly straightens up and walks off, leaving both of us as confused as ever. My co-driver threw on his clothes and sat in the driver's side. I recalled my experience with the guy up to that point, and we just sat and watched him. We noticed that every single time a new vehicle arrived, he would walk to whatever light post was closest to the new arrival and stand there. We sat for about 30 minutes debating whether we should call the police, since this guy didn't technically do anything besides act like a creep. When we finally decided to make a call, we watched the man check his phone, shake his hands in frustration, and sprint back to one of the cars in the parking lot and peel off into the night. That was the last I'd ever saw of him. What confuses me the most is what his intentions were. I was quite bigger than he was, So if it came down to an altercation, it's likely that he'd only have the upper hand if he had a weapon. If he had plans to steal the truck, well, we have logs and GPS coordinates on our truck at all times. Our systems alert our fleet manager if we're driving off when we have no time on our clocks. Plus, what was this guy doing out at 3:30 a.m. in a shady rest area? My best theory is that rest areas aren't watched very often by police, and this one happened to be out of view due to the tree coverage between the rest area and the highway. This guy seemed to have picked this spot for that particular reason. As for what plans he had after, abduction, theft, violence, it's not clear, but I'd like to hear what you guys think. About 6 years ago, I was with my friend Tom at my parents' cabin. We decided to head off to a casino located to an Ojibwe reserve, about 40 minutes away. The entire stretch of highway between is heavily forested and has no lights, meaning it can get incredibly dark. We got there and played some poker, and tried a few table games, and even grabbed some dinner with our winnings. Pretty successful night overall for the both of us. We ended up leaving the casino around 1 a.m. though. A little later than I would have liked, given the lack of any streetlights. We drive for about 20 minutes on the highway without passing any other vehicles, when I noticed 2 green orbs just off the highway before a hill. Realizing it was a deer, I slammed on the brakes and I waited. Several deer crossed and we resumed driving. As soon as we make the crest of the hill, Tom screamed, "Holy shit!" Right in front of us was a young woman walking in the middle of our lane, towards us, no more than maybe 30 feet away. I slam on the brakes again and I come in within 10 feet of her. Thankfully, slowing down earlier and climbing the hill meant we weren't going as fast, but what was going through my mind wasn't the fact that I nearly ran someone over. It was that this young woman with pitch black hair was wearing a white nightgown with no shoes and was still walking towards us with a blank, expressionless face. I'm not going to lie, that image frightened me because it looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Tom and I waited to see if she was going to pull up to our window and maybe ask for help or something. And she made it to the front of my car and then went around the driver's side. She didn't stop, but she raised her hand and dragged it across the side of my car while continuing her walk. At this point, Tom and I were both pretty freaked out. I asked Tom what should we do. He said that we should just get out of here. But for whatever reason, I just didn't feel right about leaving and not asking if she was alright. I looked in the rear view mirror and I saw that she was still walking. Having almost hit her and knowing that something just wasn't right, I decided to do something. I told Tom that I was going to ask if she was okay, but he pleaded that we just go and get out of there. I put on some bravery and I told him not to worry and that I would be right back. I put on my hazard lights and I stepped out of my car. I left my door open to provide some light and I walked around to the trunk of my car. My interior lights didn't do much, but the light allowed me to see an outline of her slightly down the hill, only able to see her every other second. I half yelled, "Hey, are you alright?" She finally stopped walking, but faced the other way. There was no response. I then heard Tom's door open as he was getting out to join me. Suddenly, she started screaming. Tom and I both ran back into my car and I just floored it. I got a lot of shit from Tom from the remainder of the ride back to the cabin. I haven't heard or saw anything like that on the highway since then, and I'm pretty thankful for it. That was the creepiest moment of my life. This past September, I had taken a road trip down to Myrtle Beach with my family. It was myself, my mother, my sister, her husband, and their 2 kids. We had used my car and both my sister and husband's car to transport everything and all of us. We had rented a beach house for a little over a week and we had a pretty great time. I was in the middle of a difficult point in my life though, and I was struggling with employment and being in between jobs. And having just started 2 new jobs fresh, I was a little low on funds and worried about making my car payments on time and the like. So I opted to head home 2 days early with my car so I could try and get more hours at work. My family expressed being nervous as I planned to leave after dinner and drive through the night to get home. I consoled them that I'd be okay to be up all night and I'd just head straight home and only stop for gas and food as needed. I'm an excellent driver. A tad impatient though, so I tend to go until I absolutely have to stop and take a break. However, this would be a 12-hour trip and I knew I would need breaks. So I made a point to stop at every rest stop to at least get out and stretch. So I stayed awake and didn't get too sore. Going through West Virginia, I'm sure you guys know how secluded their rest stops can be, especially when you're heading north from the south, going through the mountains. I stopped at a visitor center because they advertised having a fast food joint, and I had to go to the bathroom really bad. This was very late at night, maybe sometime between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. So I pulled in, noticed the buildings with fast food were closed, so I drove around the lot and parked under a street light in front of the visitor center so I could use the restroom. Getting out of my door, I took my time putting my shoes on to walk inside. Having looked around and not seeing anything out of the ordinary, I checked my phone and grabbed my wallet before standing up to walk in, making sure my car horn beeped to signal my doors were locked. Walking towards the center, I saw a man in a white hoodie standing at the edge of the sidewalk, leading into the center. I didn't think much of it until I passed him and got in all five. I glanced over my shoulder and he was watching me walk in. For some reason, I glanced to my left as I turned back to face forward, and I noted another man sitting at the benches that were on the other side of tall, thin bushes. Instantly, I thought, nope. I went in and peed, and before I walked out of the bathroom, I called my roommate. As dumb as it was, because he was a good 4 to 6 hours away, I just felt safer doing that. I gave him a quick rundown of my situation, and I made him stay on the phone with me. I started to walk out, and I couldn't see the man at the front of the sidewalk anymore. I glanced to my now right and saw both men standing next to a bench. Facing forward, I saw a couple walking in to presumably use the restroom as well. I had an impulse to ask them to walk with me, but my paranoia kicked in because I knew something was wrong somewhere in my situation, and I didn't ask, thinking that they might possibly know the men. Walking briskly to my car, I explained to my roommate that the men were by the benches. Staring the smallest of peeks over my shoulder again, I saw the man in the white hoodie walking towards me, and I told my roommate. Walking a few more paces forward, I looked back again and I saw his pace has quickened. At this point, I told my roommate he was following me to my car and I booked it. I thankfully had a key fob and got my key out and ready and unlocked my car and practically threw myself in. Not daring a glance back, I threw my car in reverse and gunned it backwards before going back into drive and sped off, and I didn't even stop to put my seatbelt on till I was at the exit to leave the parking lot. I didn't look back once. I stopped at the next toll road and I filed a report, and the workers called for state troopers to head over and check things out. I didn't stop shaking for hours, and I refused to get out of my car until I was home. I horrified myself with the thought of, if those guys had paid attention and made their move more quickly while I was facing the grounds and putting my shoes on, I would have had absolutely no defense. It should have been a beautiful drive, but it was a trap. This story is why I always tell someone where I'm going and how I'm getting there. I lived in New Mexico for several years before moving to the Midwest. My friend Amy and I, both females, would spend many days exploring the remote corners of New Mexico, discovering abandoned ghost towns and enjoying the quiet, desolate beauty of the desert. One afternoon in March 2010, we were traveling from Ruidoso to Albuquerque. Always up for exploring, we took a back road rather than traveling the more direct highway. One leg of our journey had us on NM55. It's a very remote, teeny tiny 2-lane highway. We love those type of roads. Up until that day, that is. This part of New Mexico is flat and purely desolate desert. You can see for miles. And there's virtually nothing except dirt and rock between towns, and towns can be miles apart. So we're on NM55 going north. After a few minutes, we saw a white pickup truck ahead of us, going the same direction. Suddenly, he stopped his truck sideways in the middle of the highway, blocking both lanes. We were about a mile away from him, and as we got closer, we began to get uneasy. We could see no reason for him to do this. We were the only other vehicle out there, and we began wondering if we should turn around, rather than come up to him and have to stop. We were about half a mile away from him when he pulled over to the opposite side of the highway, but his truck was still pointing the direction we were going. We tried to relax a little. Surely this guy was a rancher or something. Maybe he was checking something on his land. As we passed him, we noticed a few things. There was only one person in the truck, a middle-aged guy who never took his eyes off us. And 2, he was talking into a walkie-talkie. A few seconds after we passed him, he pulled back onto the highway and started following us. but he never got too close. He would get to within a few car lengths and then drop back a little, and then speed back up again to within a few car lengths. We were getting nervous. We realized how alone we really were. We had seen no other traffic on that road, and we hadn't told anyone about our great idea to take this detour. We checked our cell phones, and neither one had signal, typical for remote New Mexico, but scary given our present situation. Amy was driving and speeding up, while I frantically checked the map, hoping to find a road that would have more traffic, but there was no other road. We had to travel this one to get to the next town. Turning around to go back the other way didn't seem like a good option. After a few minutes, we saw another pickup truck coming towards us. He was going very, very slow, maybe 25 miles per hour, if that. This pickup was old and beat up, whereas the one behind us was newer. Amy had us up to 75 miles per hour by now, which wasn't typical for us on these 55 mile per hour highways. And we blew by the old pickup. As we passed it, we saw that it was another middle-aged guy, and he was talking into a walkie-talkie. After the white pickup passed him, he pulled a U-turn and pulled in behind it. As we watched all of this, we could see the white pickup truck guy talking into his walkie-talkie. There was no doubt these two knew each other. We were being deliberately followed. And for the first and only time in my life, I felt hunted. They stayed right behind us, and we watched for obstacles in the road. We truly thought old beat-up pickup guy had set up a trap in the road, and our vehicle would be disabled somehow. We talked about driving into the fields. We were in an SUV, but this was obviously their territory, and we were afraid of what would happen if we went off-road and got cornered. So we stayed on the highway. By now, white pickup truck guy was right on top of us. We could see him talking into the walkie-talkie, and he stayed right on our bumper. And the old beat-up pickup truck guy was right on top of him. The three of us sped down the highway. The white pickup inched closer. His maneuvering and edging closer made it apparent that he was trying to bump us. I watched helplessly as he got to within inches of our back bumper. Amy floored it. We were passing 80 miles per hour and edging up to 90 now. The road was flat and deserted, but any little thing going wrong would have been catastrophic. We were absolutely not going to slow down or stop if we could help it. The white pickup pulled into the opposite lane and started to gain speed. The only thing we could think of was that he wanted to pass us and get in front of us. If he got in front of us and his buddy was behind us, then we would be boxed in and trapped. We looked frantically at the rocky desert on both sides of us. Our only option was to off-road it. Should we risk it? Could we speed through the desert and make it to safety in one piece? As we topped a small incline, we saw a sign that said, Salinas Pueblo Missions, National Monument, and it pointed towards a road on the left. And right at that moment, a blue pickup truck pulled out of that road and onto the highway in front of us. As we came up on the blue pickup, we saw the plates that said, U.S. Park Service. We looked at each other, then looked behind us. Both pickup trucks did U-turns and went the other way. We followed the blue pickup to the next city, and then made our way to Albuquerque. I don't know exactly what those guys' intentions were, but they weren't good. There is something seriously wrong out here. I notified the state police, and they said they would keep an eye on things. This area is very close to Belen, New Mexico, which is where a woman named Tara Calico was abducted. It's also about 100 miles from Elephant Butte, New Mexico, which is where David Parker Ray had his little secret torture laboratory. We didn't put all that together until later. Even though David had died by the time this happened to us, we do believe that there are others out there like him. And whoever abducted Tara has never been caught. Or maybe we came into meth lab territory. But since this happened on an actual highway rather than a backcountry road, I tend to discount the meth lab theory. Whatever is going on out there, it's not good. This very chilling encounter is one that happened to my mother Lorena back in the late 70s or the beginning of the 80s, probably about 10 years before she had me. She must have been in her mid to late 20s. Thinking about it really gets to me, being her only daughter, which I'm sure you will understand once you have heard her story. At the time, she was living somewhere not too far from Miami, Florida. She worked in the casino on a club cruise ship and would also perform as a singer some evenings when she could. Given the lifestyle she had, it was not unusual for her to end up driving home at ungodly hours. So I suppose given the circumstances, at least one scary experience was unfortunately inevitable. It must have been around 2 or 3 in the morning and she was driving home on a lonely highway in the outskirts of the city. I am almost positive anybody could guess the next thing that happened to her, because it is just so incredibly cliche, but her car broke down. This was a time before technology took over, so naturally she was completely stuck and had no way of contacting help. Even better, the highway she was stranded on was surrounded by swamps swarming with gators. Florida, go figure. So walking to find help was out of the question as well. Now, my mother is not one to panic prematurely. She sat there rather patiently for a while, hoping somebody would stop to help her, but she came to the conclusion that most people probably thought she was sitting there waiting for a drug trade or something, given the time and location. I cannot say how long she had been waiting in that one spot, but eventually a car pulled over and stopped about 400 feet behind her. In theory, this sounds like a good thing. She probably thought it was a good thing at first as well. Just one problem though. The man in the car sat there for about 10 minutes without moving a muscle. At this point, my mother was past the point of panic and into the stages of intense hyperventilation. Looking at this man in the car through her rear view mirror as the minutes went by, she knew nothing good was going to come out of this. When she told me this very story, she even said, and I quote, "I knew I was going to be murdered." To her horror, the man finally very slowly got out of his car and made his way to his trunk, opened it, got something out, and began walking towards her. No one walks that slowly when they are on their way to help someone. And worse, she managed to make out what he was holding. It was a wrench. Now call it luck, divine intervention, a coincidence, or whatever you like. But at that very moment, a tow truck drove by and almost immediately did a U-turn and stopped next to my mother's car. The man with the wrench turned around and quickly got back into his car and sped away. Once she was safely on her way home with the help of the tow truck driver, she asked him why he had stopped to help her. To which he replied, "I got a glimpse of that man's face and I could tell he was up to no good.